Hi, John.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show on Meaning of Life TV, and you are John Thatamanil at Union Theological Seminary, author of the book The Immanent Divine, and also, more relevantly to what we're going to talk about today, in a way, the author of a chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Paul Tillich. We're going to talk today about Paul Tillich, a kind of a giant, I guess, of theology, certainly liberal theology of the 20th century. I think he, maybe as much as any 20th century thinker, embodies the challenge of reconciling religion with a kind of a modern scientific sensibility. And so I think anybody who's interested in that challenge should be interested in Tillich. And he also was just a very very major cultural figure. He was on the cover of Time magazine, which is hard to imagine today, a theologian on the cover of Time magazine, because it's been a while, I think, since there was one.
No, I don't think, I don't, I'd say it is very hard to imagine.
The other one was Niebuhr.
Yes.
Who was on, I think, maybe more than once. He also, like Tillich, he spent the heart of his career at Union Theological Seminary, which is where you are, and you teach a course on Tillich. And it was when I heard that I decided we should have a conversation about Tillich. So, as I said, he wrestles with the question of religious belief in a modern age. Let's start with a phrase he's pretty famous for, I think. He may not have been the first one to utter it, but it's very much associated with him, and that is thinking of God as the ground of being. Okay,
Right.
That's a pretty abstract thing. It's certainly a departure from the traditional anthropomorphic conception of God. But I'm kind of wondering what it means. Do you have an idea of what it means?
I do have some idea of what
Excellent.
And I try very hard to help my students see it. First of all, it's important to realize that it's actually not a terrible departure from tradition, because medieval theologians and classical theologians like Augustine often spoke of God as being itself. So God as the power of being itself, or the ground of being itself, is actually part of the classical tradition. Although in our time it's become more associated with somewhat more mystically inclined figures. But it is part of the tradition. Tillich's point is that God isn't a being among beings. If God were a being among beings, God would actually not be God. God would be on our level.
Mm-hmm.
He would just be the most powerful instance of a being.
Mm-hmm.
And he would say that actually is not, it's paying God metaphysical compliments, but superlatives applied to God become diminutives. That if you just make him the biggest person, he's just Superman, only more so.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of God is difficult. What God is that which gives being to all beings. So that's what any being whatsoever gets its being, its existence, by participating in the ground of being, or being itself. And that's what God is.
So this just occurred to me, and I don't mean it to in an overly lighthearted way, but it reminds me of the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson is the particle that gives mass to all particles. Maybe that's too strained an analogy, and maybe in the future, when things just pop in my head in the middle of these conversations, I should just let them simmer for a week before sharing them with the public. But you're saying it is that it has that, it's kind of a property, has this property giving property.
That's right. And except here we're talking about existence or being. Things are
being itself, not just mass, although some of us might have trouble imagining something being without mass, but it's being itself. God is the source. Is it the source of being? Is that the same as being the ground of being?
Yes, that would be totally fine to speak that way.
Okay.
It's also important to say that God is not just that which gives being or existence, brute existence, but God is also the one who gives us a new quality of existence. I'll be whimsical too. And one thinks of that old army slogan, be all that you can be.
Right.
Well, many of us are aware that we're not all that we can be, that routinely we fall short in terms of our capacities to be vital human beings, to live meaningful lives. We feel worn out, lacking in purpose and meaning. God is the source of new being, Tillich would say, insofar as God is also the one that makes us vital, that makes us alive, that gives us meaning. So in that deep sense, God is that who gives us our sheer fact of being, but also the one who enables us to be all that we can be. It's not the army.
Now, there is, okay, so this is clearly a departure from, what would be a straightforward reading of the Bible, in which God does seem to be a being, except a really, really impressive one. At the same time, even in the Bible, God is in a certain sense the source of being, in the sense that God created everything. But does Tillich mean something more than in a more ongoing sense? God is the source of being in a kind of in other words, I guess I would say that to read the Bible, you might think that, well, if God died, the world would go on. God's role was to create the world and set it in motion and intervene as he sees fit. But there isn't so much the sense of him being an ongoing part of the fabric of reality. But is that one thing Tillich is saying, that in a moment-to-moment sense, right now, God is a prerequisite for our existence?
Yes. And two things have to be said. Quickly, Tillich would argue with you that what his conception is not biblical. In fact, he wrote a little book called Biblical Religion and the Search for Ultimate Reality, in which he argued that the symbolic language of the Bible is always in some way pressing beyond picturing God just as a being, that there's an openness into mystery that shows that God is more. And, the classical biblical text that people turn to is, of course, the Greek translation of the Exodus passage in which Moses speaks to God and asks God what God's name will be. And that gets translated, God says something like, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. But in the Greek, that becomes I am being. And for Tillich stands in that line of interpretation that suggests that even there are possibilities for imagining God not just as one big guy in the sky, but as that which gives being to all things. So that's one thing. He would vigorously argue that the symbolic language of the Bible needs to be interpreted in some philosophical key, and the appropriate way to interpret it is to read those symbols as pointing to God as the power of being. But then he would, in fact, agree with you that there is a sense in which, for Tillich, God is continuously giving being to the world. But he would say this, too, is part of the classical tradition. It's sort of when we lose track of the classical theological tradition, we do think about creation as something that happened once upon a time. But virtually all the classical theologians would, in some sense, say, well, time itself is one of the things that God creates. So God could not have created once upon a time. God is, in one sense, creating now, creating then, creating in the future. In fact, God is the ground of time itself. So the classical theologians use this phrase, creatio continua, continual creation. And Tillich does pick up on that idea that in some sense, all of creation is being continually created.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me a little of a question that occurred to me the other day in this realm strictly of scientific thought, which is like, what enforces the scientific laws? I mean, we take for granted there are these laws that reality complies with, but if you ask, what do we mean by laws in other realms? Well, we mean laws like of society, but those have to be enforced by police and the courts. We might mean laws in a computer program, but those have to be, in a certain sense, enforced by ongoing physical processes we understand. You don't just lay down the laws and then there's magical compliance with them. And it just occurred to me the other day for the first time, like, what enforces scientific laws? And this is not totally unrelated to Tillich's conception of God, right? It's like you shouldn't take for granted that stuff keeps happening,
Oh, that's correct. Tillich would put it in the language of why is there something rather than nothing. For him, that isn't sort of a question to be taken literally. But the fact that we're aware of our possible non-existence makes us aware that our existence is bequeathed to us. It's given to us. It's not just something we have. And in that sense, there is something that keeps us in being when we ourselves are threatened by our possible non-existence. So yes, that would be a way of talking about it. But Tillich is very clear, to get to your science question, that there is no scientific nor any philosophical reason to imagine that on our plane of being, there is any super being. And he thinks the atheists are right to say, we see no evidence of this. And Tillich, in some radical moments, will say it's truer to say that God does not exist than to say that God does. Again, chairs exist, tables exist, dogs exist. God does not exist, not in those ways. God is that which gives all existent beings their power to be.
He doesn't exist because he's deeper than existence.
That's correct.
He's a prerequisite. He's an ongoing prerequisite for existence and sustainer of existence. But that makes him at one metaphysical layer up from existence itself.
Yes, or I prefer always, in Tillich's language, to think of one layer down.
Right.
The ground image,
Deeper.
Yes, I imagine Tillichians all praying to the ground of being rather than looking up to the sky.
Now, speaking of prayer, so he moves in this direction of conceiving of God, arguably in response to modern currents of thought, moves away from an anthropomorphic conception of God. But of course, a certain amount of the consolation that believers have traditionally gotten has involved a kind of an anthropomorphic conception of God. And you see that in prayer when they pray with the understanding that there's something kind of like a person, except bigger and smarter and more powerful by a long shot, that's listening, that may choose to do something in response to the prayer. But in any event, it's not so easy to see how the idea of God as the ground of being provides this kind of consolation and assurance. So what would Tillich say about prayer and about the question I'm raising?
It's a fantastic question. I'd say a two-part answer. First of all, I'd say that the anthropomorphic conception of God consoles, but only for so long. It also is the reason why people fall into abysmal crises of faith, because routinely the question is asked, well, if there is a super being who could intervene in the affairs of ordinary life, but doesn't, then why not? So precisely the conditions of consolation, the hope of some super, very powerful being who could address us and remedy certain ills by direct intervention, if that's the condition for consolation, it's also the condition for the betrayal of faith, because that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen
because bad things happen.
Oh, disastrous things happen.
Right.
I mean, Tillich's biography and life can't be understood apart from his work as a chaplain in World War I, where he was burying his friends. He won medals of bravery for rushing into places and saving people and the like. But he also suffered 2 nervous breakdowns in the midst of that horrific conflict in which God simply didn't, come and fix things. And so a kind of classical conception of God died for him in the trenches of World War I. So I think, first, the classical conception doesn't help us as much as we think. And it may, in fact, be part of the reason why so many are just sort of losing faith. The second answer, Tillich would say, is to transform what we mean by prayer. I think he would appeal to the language of spirit, specifically biblical language, Pauline language in particular, where St. Paul says, I know not how to pray, but the Spirit prays in me with sighs and groans too deep for words. In authentic prayer, Tillich would say, something ecstatic happens. I'm not just the one who is praying. In authentic prayer, I experience the ground and power of being praying in me. He is fond of quoting in some of his writings the old mystical saying, the eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees himself.
So it's a kind of contact with the divine. I mean, it's a communication with the divine in a subtler sense than prayer to him. It's not me speaking to God as a different being, but some deeper, subtler form of communion with God that is a little mystical.
Yes, I don't mind using the word mystical. He himself had some reservations about the term, but those are very subtle matters in his theological system. But yes, when in authentic prayer, sometimes I am aware that I am in touch with something that is not just me, that someone is, well, I can use the language someone, but that something or some power is praying through me. I think in my own autobiography, if I can speak personally, when my dad used to pray in our Indian Christian tradition, we routinely had family prayer. We'd gather as a family in the evening, read Bible, and pray. But when he prayed, he was so powerfully moved every single night that I felt like I was in the presence of something that was not just my dad. Mm-hmm. That he was caught up in an experience of something that was properly to be called ecstatic. Not that he, spoke in tongues or anything fancy, but that there was something in him that was not just him. And
what some Christians would say is the Holy Spirit, right?
That's what Tillich would say. I mean, Tillich does not dispense with the traditional language of tradition. All the symbols of the tradition are just understood as symbols. He's sometimes spoken of in one breath with people like Rudolf Bultmann, who used the phrase demythologization. Tillich preferred deliteralization. He's fine with almost all of the language of the tradition, so long as it's understood as symbolic, not literal. So he is, in fact, a theologian of the Spirit. And this experience of prayer is the experience of the presence of the Spirit praying in us.
Okay. We since we brought up the word mystical, and that word is so often casually used and so rarely defined, what do you mean by the term mystical?
Well, it's a very complicated notion. There's a whole literature on in philosophy of religion about what mysticism is. Usually people mean by mysticism something like a direct and unmediated encounter with divinity. Still more, sometimes people speak of it as a kind of epistemologically extraordinary experience. I call this the EEE experience, that something sort of transcends the ordinary ways in which we know things. That's not bad. Tillich says that in ordinary knowledge, there's the subject-object division is always present. I'm aware of myself as a subject speaking to you, Bob, as an object. But when the subject-object character of experiencing is somehow superseded, then something happens in another level, again, another dimension. That's what happens in our ecstatic encounters with the divine life.
Okay.
But Tillich is always somewhat cautious because he thinks that there's always a kind of mediation happening, that something in experience, whether it be the Eucharistic sacraments or a tree or a bush, that something becomes in some way transparent to the ground and power of being and shows itself there. So he prefers to speak of us meeting the ground of being in concrete beings that somehow become transparent to the ground of being.
Well, does that mean that things we encounter in the everyday world should be considered divine?
They can be. None of them are. All of them participate in being itself. So anything whatsoever can, under certain conditions, show through to the power that sustains it. He thinks of mysticism in some of his later work as a kind of direct dive into the abyss. And he thinks that there's something profoundly dangerous in that discourse, and the possibility of kind of radical self-loss, and where our particularity is lost in the depth of being, which is also sometimes called the abyss of being.
And that's a good thing in his view?
Well, no, not a good thing in his view. And he thinks that some traditions seek that more direct encounter, whereas he hopes for something more sacramental, an encounter with the ground and power of being itself in our ordinary experiencing, where something shows through to the power of being itself. He worries that those mystical experiences are unsustainable, that they are sort of moments where we dive ourselves into the deep, but then have to live with ordinary life in all its messiness. So this is where he sometimes has worries about Buddhism and Hinduism of certain kinds.
Although I would think less Hinduism than Buddhism. I mean, last time you and I spoke here, we got into this distinction between meditative experience and corresponding philosophical ideas in Buddhism on the one hand and Advaita Vedanta, a particular branch of Hinduism, on the other. And with Buddhism, the idea is that there's the dissolution of self, and that's enlightenment, is to realize that the self does not exist. In Advaita Vedanta, it's more, and this sounds more like what you were saying about Tillich, is that the difference between subject and object disappears, and there's a sense of union with you and everything, and between everything and everything. I've always argued that I'm not so sure there's such a big difference between these two things, but and we got into that a little last time. We don't need to revisit that, but it sounds like Tillich would be, maybe he disapproved of Eastern mysticism, or at least was skeptical of Eastern mysticism generally, but it sounds like he was closer to Advaita Vedanta than to Buddhism.
Correct, but he had sustained conversations with Buddhists, and Buddhists loved his ideas because he was pointing beyond ordinary theism. And so Zen Buddhists in particular were compelled by his ways of speaking. Mm-hmm. And he had a famous 3-part conversation with Shinichi Hisamatsu, in which they tried to bring a kind of rapprochement between ground of being theology and emptiness discourse. So Buddhists and Hindus have always felt that Tillich was one of the few theologians that they could talk to, precisely because he sought to go beyond ordinary theism. Mm-hmm. And his final writings were on the question of other religious traditions. Christianity and the Encounter of the World Religions was one of his books, and the final lecture he gave was entitled The Significance of the History of Religions for the Systematic Theologian, in which he said that were he to redo his entire systematic theological venture, it would no longer be Tillich in conversation with the secular or Tillich in conversation with the sciences, but it would be Tillich and Christian theology in conversation with other religious traditions. Mm-hmm. So that's precisely the direction in which he was moving. And I do think that he recognized and routinely mentioned in his systematic theology volumes that there's something similar between his ideas and Shankara. And my book was an attempt to say, well, let's do better than a few sentences. Let's actually try to understand what Tillich meant when he recognized a certain kinship.
In your book, The Immanent Divine?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of those, I mean, you said it's in a way less of a conversation with science than with other spiritual traditions, and some of those traditions are themselves, at least popularly considered, more readily compatible with science than traditional Christianity. So, for example, Sam Harris, famous atheist, in his recent book, sings the praises of Advaita Vedanta and kind of Buddhism as well, and doesn't get into the differences so much, I think. But so that's interesting. Now, so he really is in that sense, he was almost ahead of his time. I mean, he was pretty early in the East-West dialogue business, it sounds like.
Oh, without a doubt, he was among the first to do this work seriously. Mm-hmm. His only contemporary peer of comparable stature is the process theologian John Cobb, who is, I think, in his 90s now. Mm-hmm. And so Cobb in the 70s started along these lines too, in having conversations with Buddhists. But Tillich was ahead of him, and I think we're yet to equal him in some respects.
You know, I realize we've given no biographical background on Tillich. Quickly, he was German. His father was a Lutheran minister. He was excluded from teaching at German universities in the early 30s. I think the first non-Jewish professor to be banned from German universities because he had been critical of Hitler and Nazism. Is that roughly right?
That's roughly right. He sometimes misspoke, and some other times didn't. He sometimes said he was the first, but it's more precise to say that he was in the first list of people who were banned from teaching positions.
I see.
And so he was quite early, and among the most vociferous in speaking out against anti-Semitism. Tillich always had around him a variety, particularly when he was teaching at Frankfurt, a number of Jewish students and colleagues, including those people who later went on to found the Frankfurt School, which became rather famous in philosophical circles. I think he got Max Horkheimer his job at the University of Frankfurt, and in this way made the Frankfurt School possible. And I think Adorno was also one of his students. So yes, he had a deep love for his Jewish students and colleagues, and Nazi thuggery against anti-Semitism was something he was profoundly offended by.
So that's what so Nazism, in a sense, drove him to America and hence to Union. And Union's other famous anti-Nazi of that era, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, spent some time at Union Theological Seminary, went back to Germany, was ultimately executed for actually conspiring to assassinate Hitler. So now you said that Tillich's conception of God could in some ways be seen as a reaction to the problem of evil. In other words, why does God let bad stuff happen if God can do anything about it that he or she wants? So this suggests to me that along with this reconceptualization of God as the ground of being is a narrowing of the conception of God's actual everyday power or sovereignty or something? I mean, isn't that kind of implied in what you're saying?
It's a tricky question. There are two ways, at least, probably more, to speak of how contemporary or modern theology faces up to the question of theodicy, particularly in light of the horrors of World War I and World War II. One is to speak of God as in some sense weak, that God's power is persuasive, not coercive, that God is to be understood as the power of love, wooing creatures to their own fulfillment, but never coercing. So here, God remains an agent, but becomes a weak agent. I'm thinking particularly of process theology, in the tradition of Alfred North Whitehead and others, where we can speak of the weakness of God. Tillich does something different. Rather than creating a weak agent, God remains an agent, but is weak in some way, or his weakness is understood to be the power of love. Tillich removes the notion that God is an agent, but in a peculiar way keeps power. If God is that which gives everything its power to be, then in one sense, God is pretty powerful. But God isn't a being who could exercise intervening power in the way that Superman can, because God just isn't on that plane. of one being among others who could then intervene or constrain the actions of other beings. That God can't do. But for Tillich, you see, this would actually be considered a demotion of God. That God is just this one agent, albeit a special one.
You mean if God were able to intervene, that would be always intervene and change things, that would be a demotion?
Yes, it would also cause havoc for our ordinary experiences. God would then become an all-knowing, all-seeing Santa Claus in the sky, all the kinds of ways in which our freedom would be constrained. If there were an agent who could contravene our freedom at any moment, would cause real havoc. And also, of course, play fast and loose with any possibility of scientific conception of the universe, because there would always be the possibility of another agent that could intervene in and annul ordinary causal processes. Tillich doesn't want God to be that kind of being at all.
And I guess the other virtue of or virtue in some people's eyes, of a less heavy-handed God is the reconciliation with the idea of free will. I mean, this is where human free will presumably comes in. God doesn't coerce. God tries to persuade and encourage in a maybe metaphorical sense, but ultimately it's up to people.
Yes, God is, in Tillich's language, gives to creatures their freedom. Creatures participate in God. Creatures participate in the ground of being, but they are not just kept within the ground of being in what he would call a state of dreaming innocence. If there were absolutely no discontinuity between ourselves and God, we would be in a kind of perpetual innocence. We would do no wrong, but we would have no freedom either. But by giving to us our freedom to be ourselves, rather than keeping us entirely in the ground of being, we are granted freedom. And with freedom comes ambiguity, including the freedom to lose our own freedom, to do things that make us captive to addictions, to demonic powers, and the like.
And those moments of contact with the divine during prayer that Tillich envisions, if you sustained those forever, I guess you would do no wrong. Is that right? I mean, in a highly hypothetical sense?
Yes, but Tillich would say that that is never given to us. That he always imagines these moments where the ecstatic and the unambiguous enter into human life as episodic. Now, it doesn't just enter into human life at the individual level. It can enter this power into social forms. So certain historical periods can be more transparent to the power of being itself. And he calls these moments of kairos. Chronos is ordinary time. Kairos is time in which the eternal somehow makes itself present in time.
That's Kairos. Is that right?
Yes, both are Greek terms. And in these kairotic moments, and these happen periodically in history, a certain dynamic openness to divinity is present, and social forms take on a greater orientation towards justice. So, for example, you and I might want to speak of the civil rights movement as a moment in which a certain kind of openness was found in social forms. A kind of movement towards justice, a movement towards love was more concretely realized in social forms. And so it's not just private.
So these moments of kairos are moments of kind of revelation in a sense, or mass revelation, or when humankind is more responsive than average to revelation, or none of the above?
I like the last formulation. That Tillich always thinks that God reveals God's self through and to persons in particular situations, particular contexts. God doesn't speak Esperanto. God speaks to particulars in particular situation. And but when there is a responsiveness in social forms and the social processes and political processes true themselves as they listen to, say, the the prophetic words and claims of Martin Luther King, and the universe does temporarily bend. The arc of the universe bends towards justice. In those moments, yes, those are kairotic moments. So
Okay.
he's not just a private theologian of private piety. Concerns about justice were always part of his philosophy, and his earliest works were in questions of religious socialism. So the socialist decision is an argument that the truest mode of political life is a kind of religious socialism.
Okay.
We shouldn't make him into a bourgeois modernist. Some say that he sounds that way because when he got to the U.S., he started expressing his ideas in a more existentialist and psychoanalytic key. But I don't think he ever lost touch with his earlier political commitments. I mean, he still remains a socialist. And I haven't read them myself, but I'm told by other Tillich scholars that the FBI continued to keep an FBI file on him throughout his time here in the U.S. So I think at least somebody knew that this was not your safely domesticated bourgeois theologian.
Well, that's a badge of honor. One of my aspirations is to get to a point where the FBI starts keeping a file on me. I don't think I've succeeded yet.
Yeah, that's one of my aspirations too, but I'm not there yet either.
I'm working on it. Okay, so speaking of revelation, what did he have to say about revelation? So I guess prayer can bring revelation. He thinks I gather in the sense of an openness to the Holy Spirit or a kind of a contact with the divine that presumably has edifying effects. Would that be a form of revelation? And what other forms are there? I mean, I know he put a lot of emphasis on nature and deriving kind of divine inspiration from being in nature. What would he say? Science is part of revelation, or what are some things? How, if at all, did he recast the idea of revelation?
And you're shrewd to ask the question of recasting, because virtually everything in a system will need to be recast somehow if one demotes the anthropomorphic ways of representing divinity. Tillich was emphatic that we misconstrue revelation radically. When we think of revelation as the communication of packets of information, especially information that is somehow underivable by other ways of knowing and could contravene them, that isn't in revelation. I use certain, and this is a dated metaphor for younger viewers, I use certain Johnny Cochranisms when I teach Tillich.
For very young viewers, Johnny Cochran was the lawyer on the defense team of O.J. Simpson in the O.J. Simpson murder trial. Okay, go ahead.
Who likes to rhyme,
He did like to speak in rhyme. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit.
That's right. So I would say that Tillich would affirm that if it ain't healing, it ain't revealing. Revelation is the transforming power of God grasping us. When we experience that power as addressing the human predicament, we call it healing. When we experience that divine power through or in our minds, we speak of it as revelation. So revelation isn't information, it's transformation. And then we ask, what does it mean to have experienced this transformation? What do I know or come to know about God by having been grasped by the power of being? So there are sort of cognitive elements, but God isn't in Revelation telling us stuff that we couldn't know otherwise about, say, for example, a supernatural realm that is beyond the natural realm. And faith isn't, therefore, an acceptance of improbable claims about supernatural affairs. Faith is reunion with the ground and power of being itself. Faith is, Tillich would call, ultimate concern. Our human beings are those creatures who don't just have a bunch of preliminary concerns. We also ask about ultimate matters. And when our ultimate longings for the ultimate meets with an answer in these ecstatic moments of being grasped by the ground and power of being itself, we can say that we have experienced revelation. Right now, we no longer ask about God as though God were a possible object of reality. We have, in some sense, experienced God. And that experiencing of God is another way of speaking about revelation.
And is there more emphasis in Tillich's conception of revelation on the actual bringing of your own conduct into alignment with the truth, as opposed to just the apprehension in a kind of explicit sense of the truth? I mean, you use the word transformation is the reason I ask. I mean, in principle, you could have revelation in the biblical sense without becoming a better person. You could just go, yes, I see God, I see that he did this, that, and this, and you could still be a bad person, in principle. Because revelation is the explicit reception of information in that sense, right?
Oh, yes. But again, Tillich would say this is partly how moderns have misunderstood the Bible. That there was always an ecstatic conception in revelation. Revelation generates faith. Revelation transforms people. This always happens. Where there is no transformation, there hasn't been revelation.
Right.
So Tillich would say the Spirit, when it's felt, has healing power. And if it isn't healing, as I said,
it's not revealing.
That's right.
Okay, so let's just look at one more traditional Christian concept and ask how Tillich handles it, and that is salvation. Now, when I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, salvation consisted of an afterlife in heaven, and it was a consequence of believing that Christ was your Savior. So what does Tillich have a conception of salvation? And if so, I assume it's a little subtler than that.
Oh, absolutely. Tillich would say that the human predicament is marked by a triple estrangement. We are estranged from ourselves, we are estranged from each other, and we're estranged from God. As a result, we're broken. We, as I said, fail to be what we can be. We know what we ought to be. Let's call that, to simplify, we ought to be loving. We know that in some sense to be loving is our true and proper telos, our goal.
Purpose,
but we can't do it. Sometimes the more we seek to be loving, the more we act in ways that contradict our own true nature because of this kind of fundamental rupture within us. Salvation is the power of God making itself present in us so that we experience what Tillich would call new being, a kind of renewal of our capacities to be what we are called and meant to be, essentially, because we're reunited with the power of being. So salvation is not just information. Salvation is being restored to an experience of communion with the divine life. So this actually feels to me closer to the ancient tradition of the church. One of the most ancient affirmations of the Christian tradition is God became human so that the human might become divine. Athanasius. And Tillich's theology of the Spirit grasping us and taking us into the divine life feels to me closer to that more ancient sense of salvation as theosis, becoming divine, rather than salvation as mere forgiveness from without or a bonus prize, sort of like, showing up on the final round of Jeopardy. Those people who have negative points, you don't see them again because they're just sort of gone when you come back to Final Jeopardy, and it's only the people who have positive points. So, to think of afterlife as a kind of reward for moral behavior is a pretty superficial conception of what it means to be saved. To be saved is to be healed from our triple estrangement. so that we are increasingly becoming more of what we are meant to be. We become more loving towards each other, and we are reunited with the ground and power of being itself.
Okay, so if his salvation doesn't promise you an afterlife, does he have anything consoling to say about the prospect of death?
He speaks very mysteriously at the end of Volume 3 about death. And I and other Tillichians have not been able, I don't think, to come up with a kind of clear sense of what precisely he's up to in those very poetic, very beautiful, suggestive phrases. They somehow seem like he imagines us as being remembered by the divine life or taken into the divine life. But in what sense, it's hard to say. Tillich is less interested in the end of time understood as the last moment in time. He's more interested in the end of time as in the purpose of time, the purpose of life in general. Again, telos. And for him, that is the kingdom of God. And for the kingdom of God is the recreation of the world in more just and sustainable ways. So the kingdom of God is a central symbol in the final parts of the Systematic Theologian, of his Volume 3 of Systematic Theology. But the kingdom of God is never a kind of last moment in time where a radical new state of affairs comes in. The kingdom of God is always beneath us, sort of waiting to erupt in these kairotic moments. So the hope seems to be that history is always being buffeted by these depth dimensions of the divine life, and occasionally transparently open towards greater justice. He doesn't seem to be interested in imagining a traditional Christian eschatology where something like a second coming will happen and a literal new kingdom would be somehow instituted upon the earth. That kind of language is profoundly a making literal of symbols.
Okay. So the final question is not about any of these kind of really fundamental traditional concepts like prayer, salvation, but it's about a word that I've seen in my very limited perusal of summaries of his thought. It's a concept that's popped up. It's the concept of logos. Now, logos. Let me give you my quick kind of understanding of it for the benefit of viewers who may not have encountered it. It's logos. It's actually, if you read the phrase "in the beginning of the was the Word" in the Gospel of John in Greek, if you read it in the original Greek, you would find that word for word is logos. And what that means is, in Greek, it really didn't mean word, probably in the sense that we mean word. Logos at that point was kind of a philosophical idea that was written about by others at that time, like Philo of Alexandria, and it referred to a kind of, I guess you could say, a logic running through history, animating history, giving, and it's associated with the idea of a purpose in history, permeating history, right? And it was itself actually at that time, certainly in the hands of Philo, was part of an attempt to reconcile traditional religious ideas with what was then modern thought, which is to say Greek, somewhat secular philosophy. And Philo himself was involved in a de-anthropomorphization of God, and the word logos seems to have been associated with that even back then, at least in some circles, right? And
yeah, very impressive for a philosopher of science.
well, I'm not even that, but anyway, I've seen the word pop up sometimes in conjunction with kairos, the word you used, in descriptions of Tillich's thought. What did he have to say about logos?
Well, you've gone about 90% of the way there, so that you make my task pretty simple. Logos, you're quite correct, in the ancient world could mean the ordering or structuring power within reality. In some Greek philosophical systems, it could even be imagined as the world's soul, which orders the world. So it has this sort of structuring, ordering ramifications, and it's not just word, but it's also that which gives to the world ordering power, that is, structures the world, and it gives to minds the capacity to know the structures of the world. Tillich would say yes to all of that, that logos refers to our capacities for reason and the fact that the world is not just a chaotic free-for-all. There is a structure to the world. God is not just the power of being. God is also the structure of being. So Tillich would say that that structuring component of being is what we ought to call logos. So logos names not just the power of being, but the structure of being. And he says that there are, in everything that has being, certain core principles. Actually, he calls them polarities. Mm-hmm. Everything that is determined by these polarities. I'll just quickly name them: individualization and participation, dynamics and form, and freedom and destiny. Everything that is structured by these polarities. This triple structure of all things. And that's also what he means by logos. Logos is the way in which these three polarities, these three pairs, undergird everything that is. So, for example, to get concrete, we see in social life and in individual life a tension between the polarity of individualization and participation. So certain forms of social life are collectivist, right? Participation is so profoundly emphasized that the capacity for individuals to be individuals seems to be lost. Arguably, American life is characterized by the opposite problem. Individualization is so emphasized that we have no sense that we belong to each other. And you can see how terribly things go wrong on that end, too. Right? So we can imagine collectivist societies as erring by losing the balance between these polarities, by emphasizing participation, and hyper-individualist societies as falling apart due to the tensions that come to be when they fail to realize we are who we are by being in relation. So that's one of the structuring polarities that constitutes the structure of reality and the divine logos. What happens in our lives, which are always marked by an inability to hold this stuff together, is that when the power of being itself is expressed and grasps us in our lives, these polarities in our lives are harmonized. So logos structures and restructures us by bringing us back into balance, even if never in a way that, temporarily lasts forever. At least in ecstatic moments or kairotic moments, social forms and individual lives are restored to the kind of balance that they ought to have, because the logos power of reality finds expression in history and personal life. Does that help?
Well, there's a lot there. So first of all, you're saying that these polarities, like, for example, I think you said freedom and destiny is one, or so these, and name just one more to remind us. So did he say there were exactly a finite number of these polarities that are that are involved in the fundamental structuring of reality, or
yes, this triple pair?
The three. So what are the three again? It's
individualization and participation, freedom and destiny, and now I'm temporarily forgetting the third pair, which is terrible.
You mentioned it earlier, so right. So it's there on the tape, I think.
It's there on the video, and I'm sure it'll pop back into my head.
So he's saying that these are like kind of
form and dynamics.
Form and dynamics.
Yes, anything that has to have some kind of structured form, but if it were just a dead form, then it would become static and lifeless. So things also have to have dynamics. And again, in our lives, personally and socially, things can go very badly wrong if form is emphasized over dynamics or dynamics over form. if you're constantly seeking to reinvent yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but don't establish for yourself, something like settled patterns of life and habit, your life will become completely chaotic. On the other hand, if you privilege form, you fall into stasis, and you have no capacity to renew yourself. So these kinds of polarities, these particular ones, were he thought sufficient to name the core dynamics at the heart of our experiencing.
So human existence involves navigating these polarities and trying to strike a balance, and they themselves are established by the logos, is his idea, which I gather, which is a kind of a structure of being, which I gather emanates from the ground of being.
Yes, this is the structure of the divine life. That in the divine life, these polarities are held in balance. In our lives, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
Does that? I think
yeah, it's something I'd have to think about a lot. but
that is logos. These three.
And this is distinctive of his conception of logos, then.
Yes, this is how he tries ontologically to give a philosophical content for our time from his sort of analysis of our experience, a kind of phenomenology, and his philosophical work in ontology. Mm-hmm. So logos has always been understood as a structuring principle.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying, well, I think this is what are the basic structures of reality. And in God, these structures hold in some kind of balance in our lives now. And what God does when God makes God's self present is, both in individual lives and in social forms, the experience of God generates a kind of harmonizing between these kinds of poles. Mm-hmm. So artistic forms, cultural forms, governmental forms move towards justice because these principles are properly ordered. I mean, a just society emerges to the extent that some balance is found between individualization and participation. Mm-hmm. So that would be an example of how the logo structure of reality as a kind of structure of meaning, when it is experienced in our lives, renders our life more meaningful, more harmonious, more just, more loving.
Okay. So the logos sets up a kind of a spiritual obstacle course that we navigate for our whole lives. And when we're doing well, we're closer to the divine than when we're not.
Yes, much of the time we're in contradiction, barely managing to hold it together. But thankfully, in Tillich's life, there is a sense in which, as we experience in prayer and in other ways in which the power of being makes itself manifest to us, we experience a certain sort of capacity to balance these polarities more richly. But we can never get it together because he's a kind of Lutheran theologian. There's always a kind of estrangement that can be temporarily healed but never fully and finally healed. Mm-hmm. Luther spoke of us as simul justus et peccator. We are at once justified and we remain sinners. And Tillich says that's true. There's never a time when we just get all our stuff together.
You've noticed that too.
Yeah. So he's a bit skeptical about religious traditions that somehow suggest a kind of complete sanctification is possible.
Or the possibility of true enlightenment or kind of enduring, you might say, salvation. But yeah.
He would say that, look, don't we see this? I mean, don't we know that a number of our so-called enlightened teachers have fallen off the wagon in multiple ways? I mean, that is, estrangement remains part of the human condition. It can't ever be permanently conquered for Tillich.
Well, that's kind of reassuring in a way. It may mean I'm doing as well as the average person.
Yes.
So, well, thank you. In our email correspondence and setting this up, you said one could do a series of conversations about Tillich, and I'm convinced that that's true. And so maybe we'll do another one down the road. In any event, this has really been educational for me.
Good.
And thank you for taking the time.
It's always so much fun to be in conversation with such a sharp interlocutor. You just get things, and you know the right questions to ask. So thank you.
Oh, I bet you say that to all your interlocutors, but thank you. And we'll see you next time.
Take care.